The message arrived at 0300 hours, Earth Standard Time, and Admiral Yara Chun was already awake when it came through. She had not slept in 2 days. Not since the Battle of Kepler Station, where 17 human warships had held off a Dreth invasion fleet long enough for 2 million civilians to evacuate. 17 ships against 400. The humans had lost 11 of their own, but the civilians got out. Every single one. She stood at the viewport of the Yuyan Resolute, watching the stars drift past in slow silence, and she thought about the men and women who had not come home. She was still thinking about them when her comm officer knocked and handed her the sealed data chip. It carried the official seal of the Galactic Council, the 7-pointed star inside a ring of gold that every human child learned to recognize in school. That seal was supposed to mean safety. It was supposed to mean that the galaxy's greatest civilizations stood together. She broke the seal and read the message twice. Then she read it a third time, because she was sure she had misunderstood something. She had not misunderstood anything. The Galactic Council, in its infinite wisdom and through a closed session attended by no human representative, had signed the Varith Accord. Under the terms of this agreement, humanity was to immediately cease all military expansion beyond the Sol System buffer zone. Human vessels found beyond the agreed coordinates would be considered unlawful and subject to removal. Most critically, the Council had agreed to share human military tactical data, everything gathered during joint operations over the past 30 years, with the Dreth Dominion as part of a peace incentive package. They had handed over humanity's war plans. Every strategy, every weapon system specification, every defensive blind spot that human commanders had shared with Council allies in good faith. They had wrapped it all up neatly and given it to the enemy in exchange for a ceasefire that protected Council worlds, not human ones. Yara set the data chip down on her desk very carefully. She was a woman who had built her career on controlled reactions. She had survived 3 wars, 2 political purges, and 1 very unpleasant court-martial that had ultimately cleared her name. She did not lose her temper easily, but her hands, she noticed, were shaking. She called her senior staff to the briefing room within the hour. The room was quiet when she finished reading the accord aloud. Captain Torres, her second in command, was the first to speak. He was a broad-shouldered man from New Bogota who had fought in the Outer Rim campaigns and carried a scar along his jaw from a piece of shrapnel that had nearly taken his head off. He was not easily surprised. He looked surprised now. They gave them our targeting algorithms, Torres said. It was not a question. Every iteration we shared during the joint defense exercises, Yara confirmed. The shield frequency rotation schedules. The jump point calculations for the Sirius corridor. The Kepler emergency protocols. She paused. All of it. The silence that followed was heavier than anything the vacuum of space could produce. Commander Elena Vasquez, their chief tactical officer, pulled up the star map and highlighted the buffer zone the Council had designated for humanity. It was barely a shell around the Sol System. Every colony humanity had built in the last century, Proxima Station, the new Shanghai settlements, the farming worlds of Tau Ceti, fell outside those lines. The Council had not just clipped humanity's wings. They had cut them off entirely and left 300 million people unprotected on the other side of an invisible fence. Proxima has a population of 40 million, Vasquez said quietly. New Shanghai has more, said Torres. Nobody said anything for a long moment. They all understood what they were looking at. The Dreth would not honor a peace accord with Council worlds if human settlements sat outside the protection zone. Those colonies would be vulnerable. And the Dreth, who had been losing ground to human tactical ingenuity for 3 years, now held every card they needed to flip the war. Yara looked at the faces around the table. These were not politicians. These were soldiers, engineers, doctors, and pilots who had spent their careers keeping people alive. They were tired. They had all lost someone. And they had fought believing that there was a larger structure of civilization standing behind them, that the Council represented something real and worth defending. That belief was gone now. Yara could see it leaving the room like heat from an open airlock. We transmit nothing confirming receipt, she said. We do not acknowledge the accord. We do not return to the buffer zone. She looked at each of them in turn. We go to Proxima. Admiral, said her communications officer, Lieutenant Park, carefully. If we violate the accord, the Council may treat us as hostile. The Council already treated us as hostile. Yara said. They just did it politely and filed the paperwork first. The Resolute changed course within the hour. Back on Earth, the news of the Varith Accord broke slowly at first, then all at once. The Council had hoped to release it quietly, framed as a diplomatic achievement, a necessary compromise for galactic stability. The language in their public statement was smooth and carefully constructed. It used words like recalibration and sustainable peace architecture and burden sharing among civilizations. What it did not use was the word betrayal. But that was the word that spread across every human network within 18 hours of the release. Not because journalists planted it, but because people read the document themselves and reach the same conclusion independently, in 1,000 different languages, on 100 different worlds. Secretary General Amara Osei was in the middle of a diplomatic reception when her aide whispered the news into her ear. She excused herself from the room and stood alone in a corridor for 3 full minutes, reading the accord on her personal tablet. She was 61 years old and had dedicated her life to building the relationship between humanity and the galactic community. She had argued, for decades, that the Council operated in good faith, that humanity's best future lay in cooperation. She stared at the clause transferring tactical data to the Dreth Dominion. She read it 4 times. Then she composed herself, returned to the reception, thanked the Council ambassador for a lovely evening, and said good night. By morning she had drafted humanity's formal response. It was 7 sentences long and contained no diplomatic softening whatsoever. The Council's representative to Earth, a tall Villani named Sorith, received the response at his offices in Geneva. He read it with the careful, slightly puzzled expression of someone who had expected noise and received, instead, a very quiet, very specific threat. He transmitted it immediately to the Council chambers on Valera Prime with a single annotation of his own. * They are not angry. They are organizing. * On Valera Prime. The Council chamber debated through the night. Several members expressed concern. The Keth representative pointed out that humanity, despite being a young species barely 2 centuries into interstellar travel, had already demonstrated a remarkable capacity for asymmetric warfare. The Filori ambassador dismissed this. Humanity was 1 species, she said. The Council represented 42 civilizations. The math was simple. The Keth representative, who had studied human history as an academic exercise and had spent 3 years embedded with a human military unit on a cultural exchange, did not find the math simple at all. He requested that the Council reconsider the accord. He was outvoted 38-4. He filed a formal dissent, returned to his quarters, and began writing a very long letter to his family. It was the kind of letter you wrote when you believed you were about to watch something irreversible happen and could not stop it. On the Resolute, Yarachan stood at the viewport again and looked at the stars. They looked different now, not smaller. She had never been the kind of person who let a bad day shrink the universe on her. But they looked contested, like something that would need to be fought for. She was already planning how. The Dreth, receiving their new intelligence package from the Council, spent 3 days analyzing it. Their War Council met in full session. Their admirals reviewed the human tactical data with growing satisfaction. Here were the patterns. Here were the weaknesses. Here was everything they needed to finally end the war on favorable terms. What none of them thought to ask, what the Council had not thought to warn them about, was a simple question. Why had the humans shared this particular data during the joint exercises? What were they learning in return? And if the humans had known, even then, that they might one day need to fight without allies, what contingency had they prepared? The Dreth admirals did not ask these questions. They were too busy feeling victorious. And that, as it turned out, was their first mistake. The Proxima Centauri system was the first place most humans had ever called home beyond the solar system. It had taken 3 generations of sacrifice to build what stood there. Domed cities on a world that had started out cold and hostile. Orbital stations that had been assembled piece by workers who floated in vacuum suits for 12-hour shifts. Children who had grown up knowing that everything around them existed because someone before them had refused to quit. 40 million people lived there now. They went to work, raised families, argued with their neighbors, and looked up at a sky that was just different enough from Earth's to remind them they had come a long way. The day the Resolute dropped out of FTL on the edge of the Proxima system, those 40 million people did not yet know about the Varith Accord. The news was still traveling. But Admiral Yarachin knew, and she had made the journey in 41 hours of hard burn because she understood what the timing meant. The Dreth would be reviewing their new intelligence. They would spend time analyzing it, which was the nature of military planning. But they would not wait forever. The colonial settlements outside the buffer zone were essentially undefended gifts sitting on a table, and the Dreth were not known for their patience. The system's defense coordinator, a heavy-set man named Director Callum Roth, met her transmission with visible relief and then immediate horror as she explained the situation in plain terms. He had been a colonial administrator for 20 years. He had dealt with supply shortages, population disputes, a viral outbreak that had nearly collapsed New Cape Town's agricultural grid, and one extremely tense standoff with a pirate faction that had tried to extort the outer mining platforms. He had never dealt with anything like this. The Council gave them our tactical data, he repeated, the way a man repeats something he hopes will change meaning if he says it again. All of it that we shared in joint operations, Yara confirmed. They know our shield rotation frequencies, our standard engagement patterns, and our jump point preferences in this sector. Roth sat back. So if they come here, they'll come expecting the version of us that existed before we knew they had this information. Yara allowed herself a small, cold smile. That version no longer exists. What followed was 72 hours of work that the history books would later describe inadequately. Numbers could convey how many people participated. The entire crew of the Resolute plus every technician, engineer, and civilian volunteer in the Proxima system who could hold a tool. Numbers could not fully convey what it looked like in practice. Civilians who had never touched a military installation learning emergency procedures in 3-hour crash courses. Mining platform operators rerouting power systems to reinforce orbital shields. Engineers working in pairs because each person kept the other awake. The Resolute's tactical team rewrote engagement protocols from scratch, deliberately inverting every standard pattern that had been in the compromised data. They changed shield frequencies. They randomized jump point approaches. They built false signal emitters to feed the Dreth sensors a picture of the system that would be convincingly wrong. Commander Vasquez barely slept. She was a woman who thought in 3 dimensions, who could hold a tactical map in her head and rotate it like a physical object. And she spent those 72 hours pouring everything she knew into a defense plan built for a system that had 6 warships instead of 60. She worked the problem the way all good military planners work impossible problems, by deciding which rules could be broken and breaking them strategically. Meanwhile, on Earth, things were moving faster than the Council had anticipated. Secretary General Osei had released humanity's formal response not through diplomatic channels, but as a direct public address, broadcast simultaneously on every major human network. She stood at a podium in New Geneva and read the 7 sentences without dramatic pause or emotional performance. She spoke clearly and without softening. Humanity did not recognize the Varith Accord as binding. Humanity had not been represented in the session that produced it. The transfer of human military intelligence to the Dreth Dominion constituted an act of aggression against humanity's civilian population. Humanity was withdrawing its military forces from all Joint Council operations effective immediately. Humanity was recalling its ambassadors from Council worlds for consultations. Humanity would defend its colonies by any means necessary. And humanity would remember. The last sentence was the one that circulated most widely. Short, simple, and carrying a weight that most species who had dealt with humans for any length of time recognized immediately. Humans held grudges across generations. They wrote down what happened to them. They named their children after the people who wronged them as a form of reminder. Humanity will remember was not a vague threat. It was a historical promise, and every xenoanthropologist in the Council's employ knew exactly what it meant. The Falori ambassador, who had voted so confidently against the Keth's concerns, found herself receiving urgent messages from 3 of her government's largest academic institutions, all of which had human history departments, all of which had reached the same alarmed conclusion simultaneously. She read their assessments with a growing unease that she had not felt in many years. The academics were pointing to specific historical patterns. Humanity, when cornered and betrayed, did not break. It transformed. It became something more dangerous than it had been before because it stopped operating under the assumptions of civilized restraint and started operating under the logic of pure survival. Every time in human history that a power had thought it had definitively backed humanity into a corner, the corner had turned out to be where humanity kept its innovations. The Dreth fleet, 12 warships strong, arrived at the edge of the Proxima system 4 days after the Resolute. Their commander, Admiral Prime Vortak, was a methodical officer who had studied the tactical data carefully. He knew the human shield patterns. He knew their preferred engagement ranges. He knew their standard response to a multi-vector approach. He deployed his fleet accordingly, splitting into 3 groups to attack from angles that should have divided the human defensive response and overwhelmed each section before they could reinforce. The first thing that went wrong was the shields. The human orbital stations were not rotating frequencies on the pattern the data specified. Vortak's targeting systems locked onto harmonics that simply weren't there anymore. His weapons fire hit at the wrong moments, dissipating against shields that were cycling through entirely different sequences. His gunners adjusted, but the adjustment took time, and in battle, time is everything. The second thing that went wrong was the jump points. 2 of his flanking ships transitioned at the coordinates the data identified as the humans' preferred emergence zones, expecting to find open space. Instead, they found themselves facing a dense field of automated defense platforms that had been repositioned specifically to cover those coordinates. The platforms were not particularly powerful, but they did not need to be. They needed to be there, and they were. The Resolute did not fight the way the data said it would. It did not engage at standard range. It pushed deep into the engagement envelope, closer than human doctrine said a ship should go, firing in patterns that Vortak's tactical systems kept categorizing as errors because no sane commander used these approaches. Except that they were not errors. Vasquez had constructed engagement sequences that were deliberately outside the parameters of what the stolen data would predict, and she had calculated that the confusion effect alone was worth the additional risk to the Resolute. On the third vector, Vortak's ships found what looked like the main human formation, a cluster of signals exactly where the data said the humans would concentrate their force. They engaged it for 6 minutes before their sensors flagged a cascade of inconsistencies. The signals were real, powered emitters, broadcasting convincingly, but the ships themselves were not there. The real human ships were elsewhere, running quiet on a dark approach, and they hit Vortak's third group from behind while they were still firing at ghosts. Director Roth watched the battle from the command center of Proxima Station, surrounded by civilians and administrators who had no military training and had no idea how to read a tactical display. He watched anyway. He thought it was important to watch. It was not a clean victory. The Resolute took significant damage on her port side and lost power to 2 weapons banks. A defense platform was destroyed completely. 18 people were injured across the combined human forces, and 3 were killed. Names that Narration would carry from that day forward the way she carried all the others. But at the end of the 4-hour engagement, 4 Dreth warships were destroyed, 3 were crippled and drifting, and Admiral Prime Vortak had ordered a withdrawal. He had gone into the battle holding what he believed was every advantage. He had come out of it understanding something that the tactical data had failed to communicate because it could not. The data described human behavior as it had been. It could not account for what humans would do when they knew the data had been stolen. The Council monitored the engagement from a distance through passive sensors. The report that reached Valera Prime was reviewed by the same chamber that had voted 38-4 against the Keth's objections. Several members said nothing. The Falori ambassador reviewed the battle analysis twice and then asked for an adjournment. The Keth representative did not say he had told them so. He was not that kind of person. He simply updated the letter he was writing to his family and added a new section about what happened when people mistook a species' willingness to cooperate for an inability to fight without cooperation. In the Proxima system, Narration stood on the bridge of her damaged ship and received a new message. It was not from the Council. It was from 14 other human captains operating in the outer colonies, all of whom had received the accord, all of whom had independently decided to disregard it, and all of whom were now asking what she needed. She looked at the message for a long moment. Then she looked at Vasquez, who was running on no sleep and 3 cups of cold coffee, and still had her tactical map rotating in her head. "Tell them to come to Proxima," Yara said. "We have work to do." The 14 ships arrived over 8 days, and with them came something that no council strategist had modeled, because it was not the kind of variable that appeared on military planning spreadsheets. They did not come alone. Every ship carried engineers, doctors, and civilians who had volunteered for duty with no formal training and no military rank. A cargo hauler from Tau Ceti had 2 retired weapons technicians aboard who had not touched a targeting system in 11 years. A medical transport from New Shanghai had rerouted its entire route to deliver supplies, and 3 doctors who insisted they were combat-rated when they were not, but were willing to learn. A research vessel from the Kepler outer stations arrived with a team of physicists who had spent the transit time redesigning the shield frequency randomization algorithm and believed, accurately, it would turn out that their version was significantly better than the one Vasquez had built in 72 sleepless hours. Yara watched them arrive and thought about something her grandmother had told her once. Her grandmother had grown up in a mountain province during a very bad decade, and she had said that the strangest thing about crisis was how it sorted people. Not into brave and cowardly, that was too simple. It sorted them into people who waited to be told what to do and people who did not wait. The second group was always smaller, but they were never as small as you feared. She stopped counting the volunteers after the first week. There were too many of them. The Proxima system became, in those weeks, something between a military base and a community project on a massive scale. The orbital stations were reinforced. Defense platforms were upgraded with components salvaged from non-essential systems and rebuilt by teams that mixed professional engineers with people who had learned what they needed to learn in the preceding month. Communication relays were extended to cover approach vectors that had previously been blind. A hospital ship that had no business being in a potential combat zone positioned itself at the system's edge and refused to leave, its staff having decided collectively that they would be more useful there than anywhere else. Meanwhile, across human space, a second wave of response was building that the Council had also not anticipated. The economic dimension was something the Filori ambassador finally understood when her government's trade ministry sent her an emergency briefing. Human commercial traffic had not stopped. It had redirected. Ships that had previously used Council-administered trade routes and Council station facilities were routing around them. Not out of spite, or not only out of spite, but because human captains had received informal advisories from their respective colonial governments suggesting that operating inside Council infrastructure while the Accord situation was unresolved created certain legal and security ambiguities. The language was careful. The effect was that Council stations in several sectors were experiencing significant drops in human traffic, which affected not just revenues but supply chains, because humanity had quietly become a critical link in several interstellar logistics networks that Council economists had underestimated. The Keth, who had 4 trade routes that ran through human-controlled waypoints, noticed first. The Keth representative on Valera Prime was already in the peculiar position of having been right about something the Chamber did not want to hear, and now he was receiving urgent transmissions from his home government about shipping delays. He brought this to the next Council session without any particular satisfaction, because the situation had moved well past the point where being right felt like any kind of achievement. The session was fractious. The Filori ambassador argued that humanity was being disproportionately reactive. The Dorvani representative pointed out that the Accord had been designed to produce exactly the kind of stable peace that prevented this sort of situation, which prompted the Keth representative to respond, with admirable restraint, that a peace that required gifting one party's secrets to another party was not stability, but a delayed explosion. The Villani Council chair called for order and achieved approximately 40% of it. What the session did not produce was any agreement on what to do next, because the chamber was divided between members who wanted to offer humanity a formal apology and revised terms, members who thought any concession would look like weakness, and members who were primarily worried about their trade routes and were willing to say or vote for almost anything if it solved that specific problem. The Dreth, for their part, were having their own difficult session. Admiral Prime Vortak's report had reached the Dreth War Council with a level of detail that was professionally thorough and personally embarrassing. He had gone into Proxima with the best intelligence package his forces had ever received and had been beaten by a single damaged warship supported by civilian volunteers operating defense platforms. His analysis was honest about the reasons. The humans had known the data was compromised and had systematically inverted every behavior it described. The data had become a liability because knowing that the humans knew it was compromised meant that any tactic derived from it was predictable to the enemy in the worst possible way. The Dreth War Council reviewed this analysis in silence. Then they asked the question that several of them had been sitting with for days. If the humans had suspected their data might be shared, even before the Accord, even during the original joint exercises, had they shared all of it honestly? Or had they shared a version that they knew might one day be stolen, built to lead an enemy into specific traps? This question could not be answered with certainty, which was itself an answer of a kind. Uncertainty in military planning was expensive. The Dreth had paid for intelligence that they could no longer fully trust, and the act of receiving it had signaled to the humans that their allies could not be relied upon, which had made the humans more dangerous, not less. The War Council spent 3 days in closed session, and what came out of it was not a plan for further military action but a request for a direct communication channel, not through the Council, but directly with human military command. Yara received this request at Proxima Station while she was eating a meal that had gone cold because she kept getting interrupted. She read it twice, handed it to Torres, and watched his eyebrows rise slowly toward his hairline. "The Dreth want to talk," he said. "Apparently. To us specifically, not through the Council. Apparently, they've also noticed that the Council's value as an intermediary has declined somewhat." She picked up her cold food. "Set up the channel. Let's hear what they have to say." What the Dreth had to say required 3 sessions to fully convey, because communication between species with very different cognitive styles was slow even with translation technology, and because the Dreth negotiator, a civilian diplomat named Vethkuras who had not been involved in the military planning, needed time to establish that she was operating in good faith and not on behalf of the War Council's preferred outcome. Yara gave her that time, not out of trust, but because she was good at extracting useful information from conversations that were ostensibly about something else. What she extracted was significant. The Dreth had not initiated the Accord. They had received a council offer and accepted it because they were also tired of the war, and because they had assumed, as the council framed it, that the humans were a party to the negotiation. They had believed they were receiving legitimately shared intelligence, not stolen data. When Vethkuras explained this, the translation was careful and measured, but Yara had spent enough time around negotiators to recognize the specific quality of discomfort that came from saying something true that your own side might prefer you hadn't said. They didn't know, Torres said, after the 3rd session concluded. They knew they were getting an intelligence package. They chose not to ask how the council came to have it. Yara leaned back. "That's not innocent, but it's different from what we thought." Vasquez, who had finally caught up on sleep and was back to rotating tactical maps in her head at full speed, looked up from her display. "If the Dreth didn't initiate the Accord, and we didn't agree to it, then the Council was running an operation against both sides simultaneously, making a deal that required giving away our data to buy peace for Council worlds without telling either us or the Dreth what they were actually doing." The silence that followed was the particular silence of people arriving at an unpleasant realization that changes the shape of everything they thought they understood. They weren't trying to stop the war, Yara said slowly. They were trying to move it, push the conflict away from their systems, and let it resolve somewhere that wasn't their problem. It was a calculation that 42 civilizations had made together through a democratic process, in a chamber with rules of order and formal procedures, which somehow made it worse. Yara sent a classified briefing to Secretary General Osei within the hour. She included everything from the Dreth sessions with her own analysis appended. Then she drafted a message to the 14 captains who had gathered at Proxima and to every other human commander she could reach in the outer colonies. The message was short. It told them what she had found. It told them the shape of what the Council had actually done. And it told them that the fight, as she saw it, was no longer about defending colonies from the Dreth. It was about making sure that what the Council had done was seen, recorded, and answered, not with a war humanity couldn't win alone, but with something the Council had clearly never considered a realistic threat. She told them it was time to show 42 civilizations what happened when humanity stopped trying to be liked. The full session of the Galactic Council on Valera Prime had not seen a full gallery in 11 years. Today, every seat was occupied. Observers from 42 civilizations watched from tiered rows above the chamber floor, and beyond them, broadcast on every major network that reached council space, was an audience that the council communications office had not anticipated and could not control. Humanity had released everything. The Dreth sessions. Yara's analysis. The original Accord documents annotated with commentary identifying every clause that had been constructed to benefit council worlds at the specific expense of human colonial safety. The intelligence transfer records. The timeline. All of it, verified, source documented, and published simultaneously in every language spoken by every council member civilization. It had taken 3 weeks to prepare. Yara had not slept much during those 3 weeks, but she had slept more than she had during the Proxima emergency, which she took as a sign that the work was going well. Secretary General Osei delivered the opening address from Earth through a live relay, and she did not use diplomatic language. She was clear, methodical, and devastating. She went through the Accord clause by clause and explained, in terms any citizen of any member civilization could follow, exactly what each section meant in practical terms for the 40 million people living in Proxima, the 30 million in Tau Ceti, and the hundreds of millions spread across colonial settlements that the Council had placed outside the protection boundary. She explained what the intelligence transfer had meant militarily and what it had cost. She named the 11 ships lost at Kepler Station, not as a political gesture, but because she believed the people who had died deserved to be named in the same chamber that had traded away their sacrifices. Then she introduced Vethkaras. The Dreth diplomat's appearance in the chamber caused the only genuine moment of visible shock in an audience that had spent the morning being steadily unsettled. Vethkaras was not a figure the council had expected to appear, because the council had assumed that Dreth participation in the Accord meant Dreth alignment with the council's framing. Instead, Vethkaras confirmed, in the formal testimony she delivered in both Dreth and Galactic Standard, that the Dominion had not been informed that the intelligence they received had been acquired without human consent. She confirmed that the Dreth War Council had authorized the Accord under the understanding that all parties were willing participants. She did not excuse the Dominion's role. Her words were careful about that. But she drew a clear line between willful conspiracy and manipulation by omission, and she placed the Council on the wrong side of it. The chamber was very quiet after she finished. The Council chair, a Villani named Orathos who had held the position for 30 years and was considered one of the most experienced diplomatic figures in the galaxy, asked for a recess. He got 40 minutes. When the session resumed, 3 delegations had privately requested to speak with the human representatives outside the chamber, and the Filori ambassador had not returned to her seat. What followed over the next 2 days was not a trial, because the council had no formal mechanism for anything resembling one, and Osei had not come to Valera Prime to win a legal case. She had come to make the cost of what happened visible and permanent. She had come to change what the galaxy believed it could do to humanity without consequence. The Keth representative spoke on the 3rd day. He had asked for time on the floor and been given it, and he used it not to moralize but to present a technical analysis, the kind he was professionally qualified to deliver, of what the Council's decision-making process had actually done. He walked the chamber through the risk calculation the Council had made, which assumed that humanity was a junior civilization with limited options, and he walked them through the actual outcome, which was that humanity had defended its colonial population against a superior force using salvaged equipment, and civilian volunteers had independently developed a direct diplomatic channel with the Dreth, and had assembled a public case that was at this moment being discussed in every major media network across Council space. He noted that the risk calculation had failed completely, and he suggested that the reason it had failed was that the Council had not modeled humanity accurately. They had seen a species that was new to interstellar space and assumed newness meant weakness. They had seen a species that cooperated with allies and assumed cooperation meant dependence. They had seen a species that followed Council procedures and assumed procedural compliance meant an absence of alternatives. He concluded by saying, without any rhetorical flourish, that he hoped the chamber would take time to consider what else it might have modeled incorrectly before another decision was made that produced consequences no one had planned for. The formal resolution that emerged from the session was not everything humanity had demanded and not nothing. The Varith Accord was suspended pending review by a joint committee that included human representatives, real ones, with actual authority to veto provisions that affected human territory. The intelligence transfer was formally condemned as unauthorized, and a process was initiated to expunge the compromised tactical data from Dreth military systems, a process that Vethkaras agreed to oversee personally as a goodwill measure. 3 member civilizations that had voted for the accord issued formal statements of regret, which were less satisfying than apologies, but legally more useful. And the buffer zone provisions were withdrawn entirely, replaced with interim language that did not place any human settlement outside the scope of collective defense obligations. It was not justice. Osei said so publicly, precisely and without embellishment, when she was asked by a reporter how she characterized the outcome. She said it was a beginning and that beginnings were different from conclusions, and that humanity would be watching the difference carefully. Back in the Proxima system, Yara stood at the viewport of the Resolute one more time. The ship was docked at Proxima Station for repairs that were extensive enough to require the station's full engineering capacity and 3 weeks of work. Her port weapons banks were offline. Her secondary hull showed damage that the engineers described as impressive, in the way engineers used that word when they meant it must have been a terrible day. She had walked the damage assessment herself and thought about the 3 people who hadn't come home from the engagement. She had written letters to their families that had taken her 4 hours each. Torres found her at the viewport, which was where she usually ended up when she had too many things to think about and not enough of them were resolved. Council's broadcasting the resolution, he said. I know. The comm traffic's been heavy. A lot of people want to talk to you. I know that too. He stood beside her and looked out at the stars and the distant glow of Proxima Centauri, which was smaller and redder than Sol, but had been home to 40 million people long enough that they called it their star without self-consciousness. What do you think changes? He asked. She was quiet for a while. She was thinking about the Keth representative's speech, which she had watched on a feed while simultaneously reviewing repair estimates, and about Vethkaras, who had taken a significant personal and political risk to tell the truth in a room full of people who would have preferred she didn't. She was thinking about the physicists who had improved her shield algorithm and the doctors who had insisted on staying in a combat zone and the 14 captains who had come when she asked. She was thinking about her grandmother and what she had said about crisis-sorting people. The council learns that we remember, she said finally. They find out that we document. They discover that when we say we'll handle our own affairs, we mean we'll handle them better than anyone expected. She paused. And the ones who were already paying attention, the Keth, Vethkaras, anyone who looked at us honestly, they find out they were right. That we're worth the attention. Torres considered this. And the ones who weren't paying attention? They pay attention now. She turned away from the viewport. There was work to do, and there would always be more of it. And she had stopped waiting for a moment when the galaxy would simply settle into something easy. That's usually how it goes. The Resolute's repairs finished in 22 days, 3 ahead of schedule, because the civilian volunteers who had stayed on at Proxima Station turned out to have opinions about engineering timelines and the organizational persistence to act on them. When the ship departed, a convoy of 6 colony vessels and 2 cargo haulers followed it, not under any formal orders, but because their captains had decided the Resolute was going somewhere worth being near. Yara logged the convoy's presence, noted it in her report to Yuyan Command without particular editorializing, and set a course for Tau Ceti. There were 30 million people there who might have questions about what came next, and she intended to have answers ready. In the council chamber on Valera Prime, the Keth representative finished the letter he had been writing to his family and sent it. Then he started a new document, not a letter this time, but an academic paper. It was about human strategic behavior under conditions of institutional betrayal, and he was writing it for every member civilization that had voted without really understanding what it was voting on. He wanted them to understand what they were looking at. He wanted them to have the information before the next decision came along, because in his experience, the next decision always came along. He titled it, after some consideration, a phrase that translated roughly from Keth as, on the specific danger of underestimating people who have not given up yet. He thought the council could use it. He suspected, from everything he had seen, that humanity would be fine either way.